Darkness kills, destroys the will. Find a spark, make hearts thrill. Hear the tales of time so grim. Shine a light, don't let it dim. Heather Brown, downtown, bound. True crime story she's found. In the shadows, secret stay. Need a light that finds the way.
Welcome back to the third and final episode of the Gordon Cano serial killer case out of Anaheim on Defeating the Darkness, True Crime Stories with Downtown Heather Brown. That's me, your host, Heather Brown. I'm a former homicide and sexual assault prosecutor in Orange County, California. And we are here, if you're just tuning in to the podcast today, to finish up the third and final episode of a very exciting case that I had the privilege and honor of working on with one of the greatest detectives in Orange County, Detective Julissa Trapp. Thank you so much for coming back and joining us again to finish up this intriguing story of heartache and heartbreak and tragic crimes that some heinous criminals committed against 5 different women in Orange County. So welcome back.
Thank you for having me back. And with that introduction, I want to come back next week.
Right?
Yeah.
When I lead with, she's the greatest detective ever, which she is. So, well, one of the greatest, because I'm sure I'll have another great detective on in a couple of weeks and I don't want to get busted. But no, you are an incredible detective. I know that every homicide prosecutor that I've ever worked with, or even prosecutor, because you did a lot of other cases before that. You were in the sexual assault unit. We worked cases together.
Yes, we did.
And you are truly amazing. And so we were finishing up a story for our listeners about Stephen Gordon and Frank Cano, who are 2 serial killers in Orange County that you worked relentlessly to solve the case with, at the time, was 4 missing women. These women were working as prostitutes in the Orange County area, and they had turned up missing. And fair to say, society had kind of turned a little bit of a blind eye on them in terms of the nature of the business that they worked in. I don't even want to call it a business, because we all know that many of those women are being trafficked and got brought into the life at a very young age. And so just to get us back to where we were in the story, 4 women had gone missing. Nobody knew what had happened to them until there was the 4th woman turned up on a conveyor belt at a trash. Tell me about where it was.
It's a recycling center in the city of Anaheim that actually processes all the trash that we throw away. So all the trash in the city of Anaheim and other various cities goes to this one processing center. And from there it gets sorted out, and then it gets put into large trucks and ultimately taken to the Brea landfill. And that's exactly what was happening, is trash was being sorted out. A poor worker that, was there pulling out cardboard ends up finding Jure Estep on the conveyor belt. And I'm sure you can imagine the shock that poor gentleman felt when he saw a human being on that conveyor belt.
Yeah, it's just devastating. And on so many levels. So this young woman's body's found, Jure Estep. She's got all kinds of injuries to her body, unknown whether or not it's from the trash dumpster crushing her skull. There's a lot of other details. I don't even know that we talked about those in the last podcast, but she had a bite mark on her. And at the point of the story we're at is after discovering her body, and you and your team did an amazing job at picking up trash around her body on the conveyor belt to see if there was any information you could glean as to where this body came from. And from that, you ended up getting a fingerprint on some caulking material, which led you to a man who was working and told you, that they only dispose of those caulking tubes at his place of employment, which then led you to an industrial area where you basically learn about some 290 registrants. And
yes.
For those of you just tuning in, 290 registrants are those convicted sex offenders who are required here in California to register pursuant to Penal Code Section 290. So people know where they are. And these two individuals, Stephen Gordon and Frank Cano, ended up being on GPS tracking monitoring devices at the time that these women had gone missing. And so along with some other amazing detectives from Anaheim PD.
Yes.
Bruce Lynn was one of them.
He's the best.
He's the best.
He's absolutely the best.
And y'all did some amazing detective work in tracking down the cell phone tower records at the time these 4 girls ended up missing, and narrowing down the search and locating that, the 2 people that were in the area where each one of these 4 women had gone missing at the time that their phones stopped working or stopped sending any signals were Stephen Gordon and Frank Cano. So from there, you begin your surveillance, you're watching them, and you end up getting phone records, and now you know that they are suspecting that the police are onto them. You, along with your team, end up arresting Stephen Gordon.
Yes.
After he tries to flee on a bicycle.
Yes, had a little incident. As he was taken into custody.
He might have gotten hit with a car of some sort by accident, I'm sure.
Well, in fairness, he was fleeing and he did have a knife. So,
yeah, it's fair game. It's fair game. No harm, no foul. He was fine. So he then gets arrested. Frank Cano gets arrested separately while he's boarding a bus. And now, at the point of the story we're at, and I'm going to let you talk from here on out about it, because I know I've been just recapping for our listeners. You are in the middle of the interview, and he ends up ultimately telling you about what happened and how he was involved in the disappearance of these women and the murder of these women, but he was protecting what we learned was his gay lover, Frank Cano.
Yes, he protected him for a really, really long time until ultimately, with the help of the FBI and a behavior analysis expert that was helping me throughout the interview, we broke Stephen Gordon's heart, and we told him that Frank Cano didn't want to see him, and it completely turned the dynamic of the room. And it went from him trying to protect Frank Cano to, you know what, I'll just tell you everything you want to know. And everything I wanted to know was a lot more than I probably wanted to know. What he shared in those 13 hours is probably something I don't want anyone else to hear. And
when you say that, I mean, I know we're happy that you caught them, and I love the police part of this, but
yeah,
the investigative part of this is very exciting for us listeners to hear. But the reality is he told you the gory details of how they terrorized and murdered these 4 girls.
Yes.
And ultimately, in that interview, I think you might have mentioned it last episode, but if not, tell the listeners now. What did he tell you? He told you about something you didn't know in that interview.
Yes, as he was looking through the pictures, because he had asked when he finally said, you know what, I'll tell you everything you want to know. Do you have the pictures of those girls? And I had shown him photographs. And I take a break, I bring back the photos, and I actually went to go grab a piece of paper and a pencil, because I rarely take anything to write with in an interview room. And he actually starts putting the pictures in order on his own.
The order in which he murdered them?
Yes.
They murdered them?
Yes. And then he looks up at me and he says, "You're missing one." And that was something I was not expecting to hear. And as if it wasn't horrific enough that they had brutally raped and murdered 4 women, now I had a 5th victim and I didn't even know her name.
Wow.
So
in that moment when he tells you you're missing one, are you like, well, what are you talking about? Or how does that go down?
Well, so we had received their text messages the day prior. And so that whole evening I had spent reading all his text messages. And what I was able to identify in the text messages is that these 2 were prolific hunters, and they were hunting for victims pretty much 2 or 3 times a week. And there was one particular weekend that stood out to me, and it was Valentine's Day. And they're talking about having a girl. and they're talking about getting rid of her. And they're concerned because it was a holiday and the trash wasn't getting picked up on the day that they thought was going to get picked up. And so they were very concerned about that. Well, I knew when all the other girls had gone missing and none of them had disappeared on Valentine's Day. So I already had suspicion that there was probably more victims, but you just don't want to believe it's true. You don't want there to be another girl, another family to have to tell. So even though I had my suspicions that there might be more, hearing those words drop still very much affected me because I didn't know who she was.
Now, let me ask you this. As you sit here today, obviously you know a lot more about Stephen Gordon than you probably ever wanted to know, just because of the relationship that ultimately developed. And it certainly wasn't romantic. Let's just put that out. But he ended up, I don't know, taking a shine to you, however you want to characterize it. He trusted you, and he would share information with you.
Yes.
Do you think, as you sit here today, Julissa, that there's more than just those 5 girls we now know about?
Depends what day you catch me on. There's days where I think, no, they didn't stop. They were just so good at what they were doing that I find it hard to believe that they skipped December and they skipped January, because there was 2 in October. Martha died in November. And so I find it hard to believe that they skipped December and they skipped January and then started again in February and then Juray in March. Based on their text messages, I did think that there was at least one more. They have both sworn up and down that they did have another girl, but that they let her go. So I think that's one of the things that's probably always going to bug me. But there's also a certain level of trust that I need to have in both Frank Cano and Stephen Gordon, that they finally did the right thing at the end. And I think that's just for my own peace of mind. And they've both reassured me that there is no more victims. So that's kind of where I stand with that.
Okay. All right. That's fair enough. Fair enough. Okay. So you're in this interview room. You have turned the tables on Stephen Gordon because you led him to believe that Frank Cano didn't want to see him, even though you never even for a second entertained the idea of having the two of them get to see one another. But he didn't know this. So you got one up on Stephen Gordon, and now you're interviewing him.
Yeah.
And he's telling you all the nitty-gritty details. And so in this interview, you said it went on for 13 hours?
13 hours.
Oh my gosh. That's what I don't have. Well, I wouldn't have fallen asleep talking to a serial killer, but I'd have been exhausted listening to him recount. And he recounted each and every one of the details of the girls?
Twice.
Wow.
So we went through the version the first time when he was protecting Frank. And then the second time when he includes Frank in his confession and, tells me some things that, as if what I had heard already wasn't bad enough, some additional things that I wasn't prepared to hear. One of them is, desecrating the victims after they're dead. And all of this, I think, talking to someone who's talking about these things is hard enough for 13 hours. But with Stephen Gordon, he really loathed being judged. And so that's why I keep saying nasty things on this podcast, because I do believe that these inmates on death row get like cell phones and computers and iPads, and he's probably listening to this podcast. So if anybody's wondering why I'm keep saying he's a rapist, it's because he hates that word. He hates being judged, so I'm judging him, even though I'm not supposed to. So pray for me, and pray for him too. But that's why I'm saying it. I'm being vindictive. But he did rape and murder 5 women. So 5 women, yes.
So I'm saying it.
And,
he's sticking to it.
His past isn't exactly stellar either,
well,
right?
He was already a convicted rapist.
Yes.
So, and the other one, I believe, was a child molester.
Yes.
And on GPS monitoring bracelets when they committed these horrible rapes and murders of these 5 beautiful young women.
Yeah.
And it's a tragedy all around. And so let's just get back to this moment. So you get the interview, and then is it time for you finally to get some sleep?
Yeah. One of my partners, John Duran, We have a rule in homicide. There's no crying in homie, we call it.
No crying and
No
homie.
crying in homie. And I think it's just, that callus that you build, that you have to, kind of build around yourself, or else you can't do this job effectively. But being in there 13 hours, not being able to show any emotion because I was afraid it would shut him down. I just remember when it was over, walking out of the room, and the girl just kind of came out of me. And the FBI agent that was there knew exactly what was going to happen. And as I'm walking out, he runs to the door. And there was, at time, 20 people watching me interview this guy. And they come out, and my partner, Bruce Lynn, I'll never forget, he's so excited. And he goes up for like a high five because, like, you got this guy to confess. And I just remember looking at him and just shaking my head like, no. Like nothing that I heard right now was okay. And this FBI agent just kind of scooped me, and he took me away from everybody. And it was just waterworks, because it was like the first time, I think, in 30 days that I was able to just breathe. And I think I had to get it all out, because I felt so much for Martha and for Josephine and for Kiana and for Jure. And then in my head, I keep, it was just like, now who is its fifth girl? And so, although there was relief that this was over, it was also like, oh, wow, this is the beginning of something new. Now I've got to find who this fifth girl is. And that began a 3-year obsession, trying to identify her.
Wow. And were you able ultimately to identify the fifth girl?
At 3 years.
Wow. And who was the fifth girl?
Sable Pickett.
Sable Pickett. Oh, we love you, Sable Pickett.
She's adorable, cute as a button, great family.
And so I'm assuming, and we talked about this last time, but for our new listeners, that you have to go give a notification once you identify who someone is that's been murdered.
Yes.
And so you had to go and meet the family and give them the devastating news.
I actually felt really bad with Pickett's family, because I had an idea probably within a month of when this happened that it could be her. But I had to rule her out or rule her in. And that took time. She wasn't even reported missing, even though the family hadn't heard for her. And so I started talking to her mother. And her mom, for a really long time, didn't put 2 and 2 together. She was just like, oh, who's this really nice detective that's looking for my daughter? And I think eventually they Googled me. And they realized, oh, she's a homicide detective. Mm-hmm. Oh, she's connected to these serial killers. Oh, they're kidnapping, murdering, and raping women. And she eventually had the courage to ask me, like, why are you looking for her? And I had to lie. And because I didn't want to worry her, because I desperately wanted Sable to be alive. And as the months went on, it became very apparent to me that the only way to be able to definitively know if it was Sable is we ended up having to make a deal with the devil, a deal with Stephen Gordon and Frank Cano.
And what was that deal?
Immunity in exchange for information on who Jane Doe was. And with their help, I was able to positively identify that Sable Pickett was, in fact, the victim that was murdered on Valentine's Day. And so shortly after that, I gave notification to her family. I remember driving up, beautiful house in Compton, Catholic family. And when I walked into the room, there was probably 20 of her family members there. And I fully expected them to be angry with me for not telling them for so long. But they were just so gracious with me. Hugged me and thanked me. And in my head, I kept thinking, like, I'm so sorry that I couldn't have told you sooner. But Sable's grandmother, she's like, I'm so glad you did it. If you wouldn't have told us, we'd still be wondering, which I understood, but it was definitely not the news I wanted to give.
Yeah, that's got to be so hard. But I'm sure that there's some, at least, comfort just knowing that there's a little bit of closure. They're wondering, like, is she out there looking, wanting us to look for her?
Yeah.
So I'm glad that you were able to give that family closure. I'm sure that means a lot to them. Okay, so now we have all 5 girls, the deal with the devil. They don't get prosecuted, but they're on the hook already for 4 other women.
Yes.
And at that point, Stephen Gordon, let's talk about the trial, because this is like, This is fascinating.
It was a circus. It was a complete and utter circus.
Yeah. I think that's the best word for it. So Stephen Gordon, in his infinite wisdom, decides, hey, I'm going to represent myself in this capital murder case, right?
Yeah, he's facing the death penalty. And he decides that he wants to be his own attorney.
Okay. Never a good idea. So he represents himself, and he also doesn't waive time. And so for our listeners who don't know this, anyone who is charged with a felony has a right to a jury trial within 60 days of the date that you're arraigned, which means total the charges against you. So if you don't waive time, if you don't say, I want to waive my time and set my case over further so my lawyer can actually look at the evidence and some experts and, prepare a defense, then you go forward with the trial. And Stephen Gordon did just that. He demanded to have his trial within 60 days. And I know the prosecutor, Larry Yellen. He's a great attorney. He's a judge now, Judge Yellen, but he was the attorney, and he went forward and he prosecutes just Stephen Gordon, right? They're not prosecuting them together as co-defendants.
Right.
So in the trial, this death penalty case, these moms have waited for years to find out what happened to their daughters, and then to bring justice to the monsters that killed them. And so you go to trial, and Stephen Gordon is actually the one questioning you.
Yes.
Oh God, that had to have been so crazy.
You know what? I think it would have been worse had we maybe that been like the first interaction I had with him, but there was this weird dynamic, right? Like, he wanted to talk to me at the end of each day, and it was to ask me, like, how do you think I did today? And I vividly remember one day coming into court, and the bailiffs were like, oh my gosh, thank God you're here. And I said, why? What's going on? They're like, you need to talk to Stephen. And I said, okay, why? And he's like, he's upset. He was upset at some ruling that Judge Donahue had made, and he didn't want to dress out. And they're like, he's pacing in his cage back and forth like a rabid animal. Like, you need to calm him down. I'm like, me? They're like, yeah, he'll listen to you. I'm like, what am I, like the serial killer whisperer? They're like, yes, you are. Can you go in there and calm him down?
So bizarre.
And so having to go back there, and sure enough, he was really upset. And just knowing him, and after studying him, I knew exactly what I needed to do. And I refocused him and praised him for something that he had done the day prior. Kiana's mom really wanted to know where he had picked up Kiana. And so he had actually drawn a map for us. And we were actually able to take Kathy to the site where Kiana had been picked up. And that was really important to her.
Kathy's her mom.
Yes. And so I praised him. I thanked him for being generous and drawing out that map, and told him, how much it meant to the family. And you could see him kind of like calm down. And after he calmed down, he dressed out and he came out. But I mean, that was just kind of like the weird dynamic that I had in this case. And I still remember Larry at one point sitting to me, and he's like, Stephen Gordon has 2 friends left on this planet. And one of them is a homicide detective that helped catch him. And the other one is a prosecutor that's putting him away to death row. And I said, I think you're right. We were like the last 2 people on earth that would actually talk to him. So just bizarre.
Yeah. And I do want to get to, I was obviously the prosecutor on this case for a bit before I retired and turned it over to the next DA who took it in my place. But
you would have had an amazing time cross-examining him.
Yeah, that would have been something else. Oh my God, I don't even know how that would have played out. But I did have that opportunity to meet with him that one day with you, and the dynamic that you're talking about it's incredible. You gotta see it to believe it, people. If you're listening, this is so crazy. And I do want to get to that story, but I want to put it in context of when it happened. Okay?
Yeah.
But we're not leaving this episode without talking about that conversation with Stephen Gordon that you and I had, because it was wild. It was the wildest thing. I don't know. You had to be there, but okay. So, Julissa, take us back. You are in trial. Stephen Gordon's crossing you. Did he at any time cross the moms of these victims?
He did.
Oh my God. That
did.
must have been horrible.
It was.
For them to have to sit on that witness stand and let the monster who murdered their daughters cross-examine them or question them?
Yes. And I will give credit where credit's due. He actually was as respectful as a serial killer can be with them. But I mean, I think what the other part that, we didn't share is, Stephen Gordon on day one of trial, we're doing motions, and he actually gets my confession thrown out, which to this day, I'm still kind of like, wait, I don't understand. I mean, I still don't understand the ruling, but respect to Judge Donahue. So here I find myself.
So he basically in court makes a motion to exclude his confession to
correct,
you.
Yeah. The 13 hours is going to get
thrown out of court. So the jury's not going to get to hear him confess and talk about what he did and how he did it with his lover, Frank.
Yes.
That must have been, I mean, let's be honest, that was a devastating blow to you.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially in light of the fact you felt like you had Mirandized him, you had done nothing wrong.
Twice. I Mirandized him twice.
And if I recall, because obviously I read the transcripts when I took the case over, I do believe Judge Donahue's reasoning was something to do with he asked for a lawyer at some point and you said, okay. And then this is my memory, which we know is just, probably not the best. But I remember you handed him a business card and said, well, if you want to talk, give me a call. And he realized, wait a minute, you're leaving me? Like you're going to leave the room? And then he said, okay, I'll tell you what you want to know, kind of thing. Is that not anything?
I don't know. At this point, I'm just going to say right now that I still don't understand the ruling.
Okay. So we'll just leave it at that.
Say I don't disagree with it. Okay. that I disagree with it, but
respectfully disagree. But you accepted his ruling, and the confession's out.
Confession's out.
So now it's just like the cell tracking records, the DNA.
Yes.
So, but not the details about what happened. So he gets it thrown out, and then what happens? This is wild, you guys. Listen up.
Then he wants a meeting with me and Larry. And so here we go to talk to Stephen Gordon again. And so
you and the DA go back. He's in the cage, and now you're talking to him again.
And in true Stephen Gordon style, because his MO is to make deals. And he says, I'll make you guys a deal. You drop the rape charges, and I will give you another confession.
A new confession.
A new confession, yes. One that we can use. And I was just like...
Are you like, this is the craziest thing? Was Larry like, what the hell? This is the craziest thing that's ever happened?
Oh, yes. And so, we talked.
Is that because he didn't want to be thought of as a rapist?
Oh, he 100% does not want to be thought of as a rapist. To this day, he stands that he did not rape those women. I have no idea how he splits those hairs.
But he told you that he raped the women.
That they didn't want it, that they cried, that they all begged to go home. I don't know how that's not rape.
That's called rape, Stephen Gordon, if you're listening. Right. You too, Frank Cano.
Yeah, they were all raped. Brutally raped. Yeah, so that's his deal. And so, that's a decision for you big shots to make. What I did tell Judge Yellen at the time was that I was really concerned about Martha because Stephen was not wearing an ankle monitor when Martha went missing. He was in between the state taking off his monitor and the federal probation putting on his monitor. And he killed her in those 3 days that he didn't have a monitor on. And I was afraid that he would be found guilty of the other 3 women, but that Erlinda, Martha's mom, would not get to hear guilty for her daughter. And so the decision that your office ultimately made was to go ahead and give him the deal. And so on the day before trial is supposed to start, I sit down and once again talk to Stephen Gordon and once again go through all the details of what had happened.
And you had to hear another interview describing in detail what he and Cano did.
He was not as forthcoming. He was kind of very smug during this interview. He was laughing, which, deeply upset me. And then I always say, I don't like people in my interview rooms. I think it's better if we talk one-on-one. At this point, Larry was sitting there and Stephen Gordon hates judgment. And he said something and Larry just kind of chuckled or smirked or something. And it pissed him off. And he abruptly ended the interview. And that was it. He started lying. He started not cooperating. And so the interview kind of went to shit. And what people don't know is that when he got the confession thrown out, the first thing he wanted to do was he wanted to talk to me. And I go back there and he's all proud of himself. And he's like, are you mad? And I'm like, at what, Stephen? He's like, that I got the confession thrown out. I said, you know what? I think you're very bright. And yeah, you were very successful at that. And I said, frankly, Stephen, you did me a favor. And he kind of looked surprised. And he's like, what do you mean? I said, I didn't want the mothers to hear what you told me during that interview.
Oh,
and
you're good. You're so good.
Thank you so much for doing that. Now they don't ever have to hear what you and I talked about. And he just kind of looked surprised, but he was, he was gloating. To this day, anytime I talk to him, if I bring somebody new, he wants to gloat about how he beat me and getting that confession thrown out.
He did it when we were together, you and I. Mm-hmm.
So going back to your question about how was it being cross-examined by him, that's what ultimately got the confession back in, because he's trying to cross-examine me, but he can't ask me everything that he wants to ask me because I can't talk about those 13 hours and anything he said in them. I've been admonished by the judge. I can't say anything that he said during those 13 hours. And so he's asking me questions and I'm like, I can't answer that. I can't answer that. And he gets so upset and he just very dramatically stands up, slams his hand down, and he's like, Your Honor, I move to play the 13-hour interview. And the judge is like, what? The jury was like,
there's a 13-hour
interview and it's 13 hours. And I'm just sitting on the stand going, oh, okay. And so obviously there was a break and there was a lengthy discussion between Mr. Gordon and Judge Donahue. And he pled his case as to why he wanted the interview back in. And Donahue was like, we just wasted a day in motions for you to have this excluded. And now you want it back in. He's like, I want it in. And so the next day I came to court and we played the 13-hour interview for the jury.
Oh, so the jury and the parents had to hear all of the gory details of what they did to those girls.
Unfortunately, yes.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
And so ultimately you won that chess match. I'll just say 10 for Julissa because you won that chess match. Cheers, my friend. Good job on that one. So they got to hear the nitty-gritty details. And then what happened at this trial with his stellar attorney himself?
I think it was every day coming to court was you didn't know what to expect. At one point, he fixates on a juror. They were concerned that he was going to attack this juror. And
they did Donahue then put that little
he had to get
zapper belt on?
Mm-hmm.
Good.
And then shackled to the we got to cover the table so the jury couldn't see that he was shackled to the table as if, he's wearing a jumpsuit. So I didn't understand, but I get it. So yeah, he's shackled to the table so that he can't lunge. I think at one point the deputies even asked me if I would consider putting my gun in the locker because they were afraid that he was going to at one point try to strangle me. And I'm like, yeah, that's not happening. So every day was a circus. Every day was daily meetings, debriefing how he had done. And at one point, I think Larry Yellen turns to me and I don't know if I wrote him a note or I don't know how it came up. I think I wrote him a note. And I think that the note said, if we were to take a shot every time Gordon confessed during this trial, you and I both be drunk by lunch every day. Because his defense wasn't that he didn't do it. His defense was that it wasn't his fault that he did it. It was the state for failing to supervise him.
While he was on GPS monitoring.
Correct, yes.
Okay.
It was a system. The system is at fault. Stephen Gordon is not. That was his defense. It really was no defense. At one point, when he gets found, when he takes his stand, he actually looks to the jury and he says, I'm guilty. So,
that's helpful as a prosecutor.
Yes, very.
Oh, I didn't see that coming. Thank you.
But yeah, that was his MO. He got very frustrated. He wanted to cross-examine Frank Cano. Of course, Frank Cano took the fifth. So he came in very briefly, and very briefly he left. So he was very frustrated at that. He couldn't cross-examine his psychologist the way he wanted to, because he was very upset that he wanted to talk to the doctor about basically like, how did you fail to notice that I was doing this when you were giving me lie detector tests, right? And so that part wasn't allowed to come out. So he's frustrated at that. So he grew more and more frustrated, and you could see him deflate as the trial went on. And ultimately, when the jury got the case, it took him about an hour and a half to
convict him of all 4 murders.
Yes.
Wow. Well, hallelujah. I'm glad the jury got that one right.
And I think it took him only an hour and a half, because I think for the first hour they were probably just like,
What the
in the world
hell just happened?
Exactly. Right? It's like the first time they get to talk about it, and they're just like, what in the world did we just witness?
Like, he just got up there and said, I did it, right?
Right.
You heard that too?
Yes.
I wasn't dreaming during that trial.
Yeah.
So they find him guilty. I'm confident that the family members were just elated to hear that finally this monster was held accountable for doing that to their precious children and mothers, and so tragic. And then at that point, you didn't know about Sable, right?
I knew that.
Oh, he had already told you.
He had already told me. I was still in the process of looking for her.
Who she was.
Yes.
Got you.
Yeah, but the other thing that, I didn't know, and this is the first time I've been involved in a death penalty case. And so, he gets found guilty. And
then there's a whole nother trial about whether he gets death or not.
It's a couple days later, and hey, we're starting the death penalty trial. And, all these jurors, did a questionnaire. They all said that they could, convict someone of the death penalty if they could. And so we have this death penalty trial, and Stephen gets on the stand again, and he looks at the jury and he says, I want the death penalty.
No offense, Larry Allen, but this sounds like a cherry. Okay, I'm just saying, one prosecutor to another.
Yeah,
the guy confesses and then says, give me the death penalty.
And so you would think that
I could have tried that case and won.
You think this is going to be great.
Right?
No. We had one juror.
Are you kidding me?
No, one juror that was holding out.
Wait, a holdout when the defendant who just said, I murdered these women, and
he says, I'm a monster. I deserve the death penalty. Yes. And luckily, she deliberated some more and came around, and he was found guilty of death.
She wasn't all like beat up after she came out from
No.
I'm just kidding.
I mean, I understand. I mean, the weight of that decision.
It is. It's heavy.
immense.
It's heavy. It is heavy. And the reality is they're not killing anyone here in California anyway. That's another podcast.
I hope that eventually it'll turn around.
Shame on you, Gavin Newsom.
One of the questions that Stephen has asked me, and, he says, if I ever get put to death, will you attend my execution? And I said, absolutely. And I've told him I would push the button, plunge the thing. I would do it myself, not out of hate or anything, but I mean, ultimately it's his wish and it's what he deserves.
Wow. God, I feel like that's a great note to end on, but we have more of the story to talk about. That was beautiful. Okay. So that's so bizarre. Like, will you attend? So let's talk about Stephen Gordon. He's such a character. And you know what? I imagine that those jurors, in seeing him throughout that trial, were like, obviously he's super jacked up, right?
Yeah.
Like he's I don't know what happened to him to turn him to the dark side. The devil got in his brain. What? I don't even know. There's no explanation for how someone could have such a depraved heart that they would be willing, able to do something and harm. And they called them kittens or cats or something. Called them cats. And it's like they, the disassociation that you have to play in your own mind, I think. I don't know. I don't even want to try to psychoanalyze him. But
I mean, he wouldn't refer to them as women. I took off its clothes and I put it in the trash.
Yeah, that's just he's not even human himself, but he's a nut job. So we're in the trial against Cano. I wasn't handling Stephen Gordon's case. I had Frank Cano because Stephen Gordon went to trial very quickly. Larry Yellen convicted him on that very difficult case, Larry. No, I'm just teasing you, Larry. Okay. I love Larry. He's great. Okay. So he goes to trial. Then I have Cano's case. Mm-hmm. And Stephen Gordon, who was representing himself, the lawyers for Cano were requesting Stephen Gordon's visitation logs at San Quentin because he was up on death row, which has been dismantled because of Gavin Newsom. That's why I was saying shame on you. Even if you don't kill people, doesn't matter to me personally. I just want the defendants and the murderers to know that 12 people believe you deserve to die for what you did, and give the families that justice, because we know they're not actually executing people here in California. But needless to say, he's Stephen Gordon's on death row and has been for years, and now gets brought down to Orange County Jail so that he can represent himself and oppose the release of his jail records to Frank Cano's lawyers.
Yes.
Okay. And he wants to meet me. And you tell me he wants to meet you.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, what does he want to meet me for? And he wants to talk about potentially me coming off the death penalty for Cano.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Okay, so we're in Judge Donahue's court, and I'm about to go back into the tank, right? It's like a cage, but a barred cell where Stephen Gordon, the serial killer who's on death row, is. And I go with Detective Trapp and Sergeant, at the time, Sergeant, I think it's Sergeant Mundy, right?
Yes.
And we go back, and he's there. And I think the first thing out of his mouth was, "Did you tell her how I beat you at the trial?" Right? He wants me to know that.
He's very proud of that moment. And he wants to, he knows it bugs me. So anytime he can push that button, he pushes it.
So he pushes that button. And I'm just sitting back because you had told me he was very mercurial, I believe was the word that you used. Like his moods can go, and any little look, any type of judgment, any type of comment could set him off.
Yes.
And, I am prone to saying things that I probably shouldn't sometimes. And so I was just keeping my mouth shut at that point. But he proceeds to then talk about wanting to know why Cano is, why we're going after the death penalty. And you were explaining to him, like, Stephen, he earned a spot on death row too.
Yeah.
And so his whole intent was to see if he could make us a deal. And he wanted to tell us that he would testify for us in the trial if we would come off the death penalty for Frank Cano.
Yeah.
And as for any of you listeners, we don't negotiate the death penalty. We don't take it off the table in exchange for this. It doesn't work that way. However, the funny part about the story was he then at some point learns that we had to turn over a letter he wrote to you.
Yes.
To Frank. Now, mind you, they're lovers, okay? Mm-hmm. So he sends you a letter. I don't even know what he wrote in the letter. I don't remember anything about the letter, but we turned it over to the lawyers for Frank.
Yeah.
And he's upset about that. And so I explained to him, hey, listen, as long as he's still a co-defendant of yours, anytime you write to Detective Trapp, we need to turn it over. Once the case is over and he's on death row with you, you can write Detective Trapp all the Christmas cards you want. Yeah. But up until then, we got to turn it over. So we're having this conversation, and he says something about, I said, when I mentioned Christmas cards, he goes, oh, I'm not complaining, but you couldn't imagine all the lame ass Christmas cards I get from my lawyer. And we're like, what? And he goes, I'm not complaining, but he'll give me like 5 Christmas cards a year. And they're just like the lamest Christmas cards. They're just like old and stupid or whatever. And he goes, and I get a lot of mail. You wouldn't believe all the mail. Do you remember this?
Yes.
He goes, you wouldn't believe all the mail I get.
Yeah.
He goes, I got this one chick from Texas. She writes to me every day. I just want to die. I hate my life. I want to die. I want to die. I want to die. And he goes, and then she writes, I can't believe they want to kill you. They want to put you to death and you don't even want to die. I pray every night that they release you so you can come to Texas and kill me. Right. And then he looks at both of us and he goes, and you think I'm fucking crazy? Do you remember that?
I do, yes.
Was that the crazy? I'm like, a serial killer just told me about some crazy broad in Texas. It was so weird and wacky, that whole conversation.
He's, for someone, he's so bizarre. And yet,
like, he showed us a letter that some girl wrote Skeeter, called him Skeeter. Yeah. He's like, you know why she calls me Skeeter, don't you? Mm-hmm. And we're like, why? He goes, because I'm a sharpshooter. Yeah. Like, he's just he's a character, and it doesn't even feel real that he's the guy that
I know.
committed such heinous acts, right?
He wrote me a letter asking to get him his girlfriend a present.
You
And he
get-
wanted me to wrap it.
Did you get her one?
No.
Okay.
I did not.
You draw the line there.
I'm drawing the line again.
Okay, you'll push the button when we put him down.
Absolutely, yes.
But you won't buy his
Yes.
girlfriend a gift. Okay,
No,
that's
no.
the line that Detective Trapp will draw. I love it. I love it. Oh my God. Okay, so then what happens? So then Frank Cano basically pleads guilty and gets life without parole. He pleads guilty to life without parole, and they took
does.
death off the table.
Yeah.
I think after Gavin Newsom dismantled the death row and then started spreading out the serial killers amongst California. For those of you that don't know this, there is really no death row anymore.
No.
They have spread all of the serial killers out into the prisons in California, and they're just walking around with their iPads now. So,
And it really is a deterrent. I actually went to see Stephen Gordon in San Quentin, and he told me then that he did not want Frank Cano to come up to death row. He says he won't make it.
he's got asthma.
This is hard time. I haven't seen the sky since I arrived here at San Quentin because their rec time is basically in a dog run and there's a roof. And he told me, he goes, Detective Trapp, I haven't seen the sky since I got off the bus. And I'm like, well, Stephen, it's death row. And he understood, but he definitely noted that there was a huge difference between being in a regular prison and being in San Quentin,
Yeah, there is.
which is where he deserved to be.
Amen. I agree. I wish they were both there now, waiting every day, wondering if someone was going to go and push the button. If Detective Trapp was going to show up
I'm pushing it.
and push it.
Yeah.
Well, gosh, I don't even know how to thank you enough on behalf of the citizens of Orange County, these families,
thank you.
that you brought justice to these families. You truly are an amazing human being, a phenomenal detective. I'm sad we don't get to work together anymore.
Me too. Very much so.
We've had some great crazy cases, and I'd love to have you on and talk about some other cases we've worked together.
Oh, there's definitely been some doozies.
Yeah.
I don't know if I could top Stephen Gordon though. He is in a league all of his own.
Do you
for
think you're
sure.
going to get a Christmas card this year from him?
You know, I still remember in trial sitting there with Larry, and he's like, and he leans over and he goes, I bet he writes you from death row. And I'm like, what? You're crazy. I'm like the detective that put him away. And then he started writing me from death row, asking me to get his girlfriend present. So I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. You know, I think he wants people to know in a weird way that he's sorry. I know one of the things that he was Googling before he was arrested was, you know, he was trying to find his faith again. I think he was Googling if God forgave murder. So he's, you know, in one breath, he is pure evil. And in another, you see a small glimpse of what's left in him that's human. But I can tell you that 14 years in homicide, I've talked to a lot of people and I've sensed a lot of evil. And I told myself after that trial that I would never be in a room alone with him again. And so anytime I go now, I take someone with me almost as a protection for my soul.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably a really good call. I think, you know, God does forgive. He does forgive, but that's between him and God.
Of course.
You know.
And part of that starts with asking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I hope he is sorry, and I hope he does ask for forgiveness and that God saves his soul. And, you know, my hat's off to you for facing such evil. And you really did bring the light to those families and bring justice to those families. And for that, I thank you. And, you know, I'm sorry you're not a detective anymore, that you're out on patrol, but I know you're doing God's work out there. And I just pray for your safety.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for coming on and
Thank you
wrapping
for
this.
having me.
No, it was been such a great honor and a pleasure to have you here, Julissa. I think you're amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you for shining the light in the darkest places for people. God bless you. And until we meet again, that's a wrap, you guys. If you can't, find the light, be the light, like Detective Trapp is out there in Anaheim fighting for justice of victims of crimes. Have a great night, and we'll see you next time.